Yeah, you've been a busy man, I'm sure.
I'm sure you have as well. As soon as Israel decided to strike the airport that Turkey was meant to send military assets to, maybe already sent military assets to, suddenly, first thing I thought of is Colonel Macgregor must be watching this and smirking right now.
I never smirk.
I'm sure you were laughing out loud then. um, but yeah, that's pretty extraordinary event yesterday. There's a lot of talk about these two countries clashing, and Tom Barak, when he was talking to Israeli media, he said he told I-24 News. So just for the audience that doesn't know, so yesterday we got news that Israel struck an airport in Syria. That first time they strike Syria in I think about a year, and that
Right.
airport was about to be used by the Turkish military. And I think they had personnel there to deliver military assets. Some reports that there were Turkish military assets already there. We got a report that the Israelis did meet and speak to Turkey beforehand, and they spoke to to Syria beforehand and warned them about Turkish expansion into Syria, and they struck it. We got report. We got. I saw satellite images of the craters on the runways. I don't think there's any Turkish casualties or any Turkish military assets actually destroyed, but we don't know. That's based on the satellite images I've seen. Maybe you've got more information. I'll go. I'll read Tom Barak's comments afterwards, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this development.
Well, as far as I know, there were no Turkish casualties. Whether or
Oh,
not there was any equipment there, I have no idea. I think what we need to take away from this is sure, I'm confident that some form of comment or warning was issued, which I'm sure was taken as an insult and ignored, especially in Ankara. But then I also think they waited, watched probably on satellite surveillance. They watched to see the Turkish officers who were sent there to survey the place and evaluate it leave. And after they left, that's when the Air Force came in and demolished the airfield. So that much I think we can say. When this first began, this sort of Turkish Israeli agreement that we crafted in order to promote the dissolution of Syria, in other words, its liquidation and then its resurrection subsequently in the hands of our friends from ISIS. A number of things were discussed, but I said that at the time I thought it was the Middle East's version of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. That it was a temporary cessation of hostilities. It would not last, and inevitably there would be an Israeli-Turkish war. So I fully expect that that will occur at some point in the future. This is an extraordinarily bad time for Israel to cultivate bad relations with the Turks because the Turks, despite all of the unkind things said by both sides, have continually transported oil from Azerbaijan through Turkey down past Syria and into Israel. The Turks have also sold billions of dollars worth of goods, especially agricultural products, to the Israelis. So Erdogan had practiced what he does best, which is to talk out of both sides of his mouth. On one side, he was pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over the Israelis for their mass murder in Gaza and their actions in Lebanon. Then he turns right around and essentially does business with them. And this has been a sore point, I think, with a lot of people in the Muslim world. Most Americans are completely unaware of it. I don't think most Europeans care, but I certainly think in the Islamic world this has not gone down well. But there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. Since then, we've seen lots of cooperation between the Iranians and the Turks to deal with the Kurdish problem. And the Kurds, of course, not all of them, but a large portion of them are exceedingly dependent upon Israeli support, arms assistance, and intelligence. And indeed, we cooperated with the Mossad in a vain hope of stirring up a Kurdish rebellion slash invasion of Iran. The Iranians had them targeted, destroyed them, and I don't see much evidence that that's going to happen. And of course, the Turks had no interest in letting that be successful either. So now what? Everyone says, well, Turkey is a member of NATO. Is that really meaningful? I'm not sure that it really is. I think that Erdogan is perfectly willing to stay a member of NATO and wage war with anybody he cares to anywhere in the world. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, we're over a barrel because, of course, President Trump has recently pointed out that one more time that Mr. Erdogan is a personal friend of his, and he has a great relationship with Mr. Erdogan, and things are really great with the Turks. Well, they're not so hot right now. So I don't know what it means short term. I just think long term, it's another indicator that you're going to see a collision between the Turks and the Israelis. And as I say, it's a very bad idea on the part of the Israelis because in the meantime, you've had this new alignment, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, and everybody has said, well, what's it really about? Well, contrary to popular belief, it's not about attacking Iran. I'm sorry, it is not an anti-Iranian alliance. It has a great deal to do with putting an end, ultimately, at some point in time, to the Greater Israel Project. They're not going to allow that to succeed. So, under the circumstances, you would say the prudent thing for the Israelis at this point is to find a way to avoid any unnecessary collision with Turkey until certainly this issue with Iran is settled. Well, they've chosen not to do that because, well, they're arrogant. And they're also completely confident that they have control of us. And they seem to think that in addition to fighting the Iranians, that we could be dragged into a conflict with the Turks as well. And of course, they've also built an alliance system in a sense because they're closely aligned with the Greeks and with Cyprus against the Turks. And they hope that our Mediterranean fleet and whatever forces we have could be employed in that endeavor. Ultimately, everything's shaping up brilliantly for a much larger regional war, something no one expected.
Well, that's what Tom Barrack said anyway. I forgot the same. So Tom Barrack told I-24 that Israel strikes on Syria's Abu al-Dur airbase carried a real risk of triggering a direct military confrontation with Turkey and Syria. Barrack said Turkish forces were not warned about the Israeli aircraft or their objective and could have scrambled fighters believing Turkey was under attack. Quote, yesterday's events were serious and worrying. Washington is now holding quiet talks on establishing a permanent deconfliction mechanism between Israel and Syria, potentially involving Turkey, with a 24-hour coordination center to prevent future misunderstandings. Now, you've made the very important point that Erdogan does a lot of business with Israel, despite the rhetoric, and especially the oil coming out of Azerbaijan and the agricultural product coming out of Turkey. But why war? Why? What is Turkey's benefit with this war? What is Israel's benefit? They don't share a border. They're very far from one another. Is it just expanding influence in the region? And as they fill that vacuum left by the US, starting with Syria, that could lead to a clash?
Well, I think from the Turkish standpoint, privately, they regard Syria as a Turkish province. They also regard most of northern Iraq as a Turkish province. Turkish generals have made it very clear to American generals for many, many years in Iraq during the occupation that as far as they were concerned, places like Erbil were Turkish cities. And remember that the northern oil fields that we regard as part of Iraq were historically part of Turkey. And the Turks were very angry after World War I that all of that was taken from them. So I think the Turks have a different view of the region from what you're suggesting. And they think that the Israelis are encroaching on them. And the Israelis have threatened openly to take Damascus. And certainly I'm not sure there's much to stop them from doing so. But remember that when the Turkish foreign minister arrived for his first meeting in Damascus with the new ISIS graduates that have taken over the country, he first went to a mosque where a Turkish sultan is interred. I've forgotten the name of the sultan. This has been a few years ago. And that was a huge signal to everybody in the region who knows anything about the Turks and the history of the region that the Turks were back. That was not an accidental visit. That was a signal to the Israelis that the Turks will not tolerate the capture of Damascus. So I think this whole business is far more serious. Now, they have this new alignment with Saudi Arabia. Can Saudi Arabia compensate for whatever business they may lose with the Israelis? Well, perhaps. Certainly the Saudis have oil and cash. The Turks and the Pakistanis need both. So I'm sure that's part of the consideration. But at some point, you reach a decision where all of these other rational calculuses don't matter anymore. If anyone was rational in 1914, Germany and Russia would never have gone to war.
Yeah.
Germany and Russia were each other's top trading partners. They had a very profitable relationship. They had a very good national security relationship. Russia and Prussia, Germany, were effectively committed to no aggression against each other and, to the extent they could, to help each other and stabilize. Even Austria-Hungary, to a large extent, fell into that category. But what happened? You got a war anyway. So whatever benefits Turkey accrues from cooperating with the Israelis, which of course involves us because we're anxious to ensure that Israel, Greater Israel, succeeds. So we're the Israeli agent that negotiated the original agreement behind closed doors between Turks and Israelis on how to divide up the region. And obviously, we want the Israelis to have their Greater Israel. But that may no longer be acceptable to Mr. Erdogan. He may read the tea leaves differently. He may judge the situation to have changed. And remember, I've always sort of tried to characterize him as a sort of bird of prey that sits on the top of the telephone pole and waits for the roadkill and then goes down and grabs it and devours it. And I don't know to what extent he thinks Israel is approaching roadkill status, but they're getting closer because their country is being not entirely, but certainly substantially destroyed and harmed. And they seem ready to renew the war with Iran that they want to drag us into. So all of these, I think Mr. Erdogan is not going to act foolishly or emotionally or quickly, but I think he's getting closer to the action point.
How significant would it be if they do get these F-35s? We talked about them before. They're still trying to sell their S-400 air defense systems to get the F-35s they've been waiting for years from the US that Israel's trying to sabotage. And the next question I want to ask you about the nukes that the US has in Turkey, but that's a separate question. But maybe we can add them both together because there is nukes that are inside Turkey. I don't think Turkey. I was speaking to a guest who did mention something along the lines of these nukes could be. They're not. They don't need launch codes or anything. They're just a bomb, so they could be dropped from an aircraft. So the fighter jets, Turkish fighter jets, could actually potentially drop these nukes. I'm not sure if you have more context on this.
Well, I know that I wrote a memorandum that was designed for President Trump that I sent over to the White House while I was in the Pentagon, urging him to withdraw all the nuclear weapons from Turkey. And at the time, I argued that this was a prudent action. That we didn't need them anymore. They were originally placed there for potential use against the Russians. And I think most of them are gravity bombs. I think like the B-61, maybe one of them. I don't remember all the designations, but these are Air Force delivered nuclear bombs that don't need. Well, they're not launched, let us say, as cruise missiles or tactical ballistic missiles. And I thought it was a good idea to get them out because at some point, you might have a decision made at very high levels to take control of them, not for the purpose of using them, but potentially to prevent us or anybody else from getting to them. It's a possibility. I've thought that Turkey's position in NATO has been very fragile for a long time. And I had personally very positive experiences with Turkish officers. I worked with them. I thought they were very professional. I thought the Turkish military was very professional. It was very, very tough, very, very serious. So I see them as a powerful actor on the ground, certainly in the Middle East. But I just thought it was prudent for us to get those nukes out. Obviously, that never happened. Nothing changed. I think that's unfortunate. But I don't think it's the emergency. Because if the Turks actually need a nuclear weapon, they'll get it from Pakistan. And the Pakistanis have made that very, very clear. That was made clear to us back in 2011. The Turkish General Staff said, look, if we need a nuclear weapon, we don't need you. The Pakistanis have promised it to us. So that's why you're seeing this Pakistani-Turkish Saudi Arabian alliance. They're not just Sunni Muslims. There are other things involved in this. So I don't know. I think it's, this is the kind of thing that when you go to war without having prepared to do so, without having looked at all the consequences, both anticipated and unanticipated, you can provoke a regional meltdown. And I think that's what we're watching.
Yeah.
I laugh. I listen all the time to people say, well, when this is over, President Trump has this magic formula. He's changing the architecture of the Middle East. Well, he's definitely changed the architecture, but I don't see any magic formula. And I don't see any future role for us. So that's the problem right now. And I don't think that President Trump is prepared to accept that reality. And I don't think the people around him will let him do that. The Israelis certainly won't, because Israel's whole existence at this point is going to depend on our continual presence and support for them. And if we pull out lock, stock, and barrel, which I'm sure at some point we will do, probably sooner rather than later, they're going to be very unhappy. That's why you've heard these discussions about stationing U.S. forces on Israeli territory.
What do you make of the current impasse between the US and Iran, and the warnings by Iran that they will escalate if the blockade continues? So instead of just waiting it out and letting the Americans choke off Iran, they know they've got the upper hand kinetically. So they might be the one to strike first.
Well, I think they do have the initiative strategically. They control the high ground, so to say. They're in control of the strait. Somebody said to me, well, we still know that some number of barrels of oil are getting through every day. Maybe one ship gets through. And of course, I'm sure there's a certain amount of graft. If you pay the IRGC enough on the side, I'm sure they'll let you go through with something. But none of that makes up for the loss that we've taken through the closure of the strait. Now, Mr. Trump can talk about how he's in control, and I guess he wants to make that part of the world U.S. territory. I can't wait to see numbers of Americans line up for the purpose of migrating into this new territory and settle it. But this sort of strikes me as being, another Trumpian exercise in self-sodomization. Very stupid. So I hope that they'll drop all this nonsense. But haven't seen much evidence for rationality right now. And the Israelis are in charge. Mr. Netanyahu is in charge, and Mr. Trump is going to do what he wants. So that's why I see another round of conflict coming. It may be the last round, but I see another round coming. And I think that's why you're now hearing these discussions about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Because I think we've sort of reached down to the bottom of the pit for tools and ways to do business. We figured out they don't work. And so somebody said, well, let's go into, door number 2 and see what we can pull out of that. And so there's a discussion about tactical nukes.
Do you think they're genuinely discussing that as an option?
I would like to
be wild to me. It's just the reason why I'm struggling to believe they are. It doesn't make sense for even the most irrational person. The cost just outweighs the benefit in so many different ways, financially for the US, reputationally, militarily, and for Trump's legacy as well. The list politically for Trump, the list goes on and on. There's very little benefit, and it won't get any outcome. And it's very easy to know that the Iranians won't fold just because of one tactical nuke.
Well, there was no rationality behind Great Britain's decision to enter the First World War. None. There was no driving issue that compelled them to fight. Economically, it made no sense to them. They were heavily dependent on Germany for a whole range of critical products and chemicals and optics and so forth. No German soldier had shot at a British soldier, as far as I can tell, for hundreds of years. In other words, it just made no sense. On the other hand, the French were an annoyance and a permanent menace. If they'd entered the war to speed the end of the war by threatening the French, then that would have made more sense from the standpoint of British strategic interests. So I don't think rationality has anything to do with it. I don't see any rationality in any of it. First of all, I was reminded the other day that in the official history of the British intervention in the Dardanelles in 1915, it ended by saying that the preparations for the evacuation of the 500,000 British and Allied troops that were in the Dardanelles was infinitely better and more detailed than the preparations for the initial intervention by only 50,000. In other words, 9 months after failure, they leave, but they failed the day they entered. They never had enough troops to do any of the things they wanted to. They grossly underestimated the Turks. That's what we've done. We grossly underestimated Iran. Secondly, we grossly overestimated ourselves. We're a short war structure, force structure. We're designed to go in and fight for a couple of months, not to fight for a year or 2 years or anything else. The Iranians were prepared for the long haul. We weren't. So now what do? Well, that's when you turn to tactical nuclear weapons, at least at the outset, because you think that may be a tool that'll pry open the box and out comes, Iranians ready to surrender and do your will. I think it's absolute nonsense. I see no evidence that if you use a nuclear weapon or not, that these people are going to surrender to you. That's a very dumb idea. But I think it's being considered. Look, Elbridge Colby, who is in the policy side of the Pentagon, has advocated for this. The Air Force and the Navy have always liked.
Elbridge has advocated for nukes.
For tactical nuclear weapons as something that we could use in future warfare. And so have many of the senior officers in the Navy and the Air Force over many years. I mean, this is why they exist. We started building these tactical nuclear weapons years ago, and it never made a great deal of sense because Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs back in the 1990s, was approached about this because we would run these exercises against the Soviets in Europe. That was usually the standard operation. And then at some point, the war game would end. It usually ended in Central Europe with us being overwhelmed by the vast numbers of Soviet forces. This is in the 80s and the early 90s. And then they said, what are you going to do now? And there was a discussion of, well, we turned to tactical nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. And Colin Powell says, what makes you think that will work? Oh, well, a tactical nuke here, a tactical nuke there, and the Russians will see they can't proceed and everything will stop. And he said, what are you talking about? You mean the Russians are going to sit there and look at you employ a tactical nuclear weapon, see the explosion, the detonation, and say, well, that's a small nuclear weapon. That's not a big problem. Don't worry about that. He said, that's ridiculous. Said they'll use whatever they got against you. Now, we've got a different situation today. I heard somebody come on and talk about, well, we used a nuclear weapon against the Japanese. And people debate whether or not that was needed. That's irrelevant. We did. And they forget something. At that point, Japan was completely isolated. Japan had effectively lost the war. All we did was accelerate the end. Now, what do we have in Iran? Iran's not isolated. In fact, right now, both the Russians and the Chinese are rapidly replenishing stocks of repair parts, equipment, even warheads, I'm told, as well as missile bodies and engines. And they're providing food and medicine and other things. So Iran is not isolated. It has two of the most powerful states in the world as its allies. So what makes you think using a nuclear weapon is going to have any positive effect whatsoever for the United States? All it does is open Pandora's box, convinces everyone that we're completely crazy, that we cannot be trusted. Everybody knows that anyway, but now they'll absolutely conclude that. And the Russians and the Chinese will change many of their policies and approaches. We may well see tactical nuclear weapons used in the near term in Ukraine to finish up the Ukraine war quickly and then close up on the border with Poland. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can happen. We may see nuclear weapons transferred very quietly to the Iranians so that they could use them. Why would you ever do something that stupid? Well, the whole war is pretty damn stupid. It makes no sense. It was never required. So why should we stop at this much stupidity? Let's go full force.
Colonel, we're talking about a direct conflict between Israel and Turkey. We're talking about what happens to Syria. Will it be partitioned? We've talked about Lebanon and Hezbollah and Israel trying to defeat Hezbollah. We're talking about the Gulf. The UAE was attacked yesterday. Now, Iran says that in attacking, they were attacking ships. The UAE said they did attack it and it cut all trade with Iran. We've got the Houthis attacking Saudi. They attacked him yesterday. How do you see all this end in a couple of years? Are we looking at, a new, I know we're looking for a new reality in the region, but how is it going to end from a military perspective? Are we going to get there violently? Or are we going to see the worst of it maybe now, or have we already seen the worst of it?
There's something else that we have to mention that doesn't get much attention in these discussions of geopolitics and military power. We're watching the bond market crash in the United States. We've seen
Yeah.
Bethel to intervene in all of that to buy up long term bonds, the 30 years, in order to drive down yields, at least temporarily. And we've watched the stock market profit from this as another injection of liquidity. This works on a very short term basis, but it sets up a catastrophic outcome long term. And the question is, how long term is that? And again, people who are much smarter than I am and have much better information than I do in the marketplace, like Jeffrey Gundlach is a good example, someone you might consider bringing on. You talk to Pilkington, you've talked to Curie. They've sketched out scenarios for you. I think the bond issue is a very serious one in the United States. And everyone says once you're over 5% in the 10-year, everything collapses. In other words, the dollar itself as a currency is finished because you can't pay your debts. The national sovereign debt is too overwhelming. There are people right now who insist we're already in a national sovereign debt crisis. It's just that people aren't aware of it. They don't understand what's really happening. We've already seen what happened in Japan, and we used euros to prop them up. That's not a solution. Nothing is fixed in Japan. Nothing is being fixed in the United States. If we were serious about our own economic, and I would argue societal fragility, we would end this right now. We would simply say, we've done all that we can. We are going to disengage our forces and we will resume discussions with the Iranians once we've disengaged our forces, but we can do no more. Now, why won't that happen? Because of Israel. The Israelis will not allow that to occur. Why not? They know that once we leave, we will never be back. And once we're gone, Israel is effectively on its own. And the question is, how long will Israel survive under those circumstances? So I guess what I'm saying is that you have on the one side the economic and financial fragility that's undermining our position globally, strategically, and also militarily. And then you have the misuse or abuse of American military power in a setting for which it was never designed to fight an enemy that it cannot defeat. So which of these blows up the United States first? Or do they both get together?
Oh, they're very intertwined. They're very intertwined. The bond yields, like Japan, for example, that process has been sped up because of this war.
Exactly. So I don't think it's a question of ending because we want to end it. It's going to end whether we like it or not. And I don't see how it ends in any particularly positive way, but the least damaging way would be for us to disengage. Now, if you're sitting in the UAE, you're sitting in Kuwait, you're sitting in Bahrain, sit wherever you like in the Persian Gulf, you better figure a couple of things out. First of all, the Iranians live next door. They're not going anywhere. The Americans don't live there. They're going home. The question is when? And the answer is probably soon, although we can't really tell that at the moment. But I think we can bet pretty heavily it's going to be soon. Why? Well, what are we there for? What are we trying to achieve? We can't protect anybody. We can't even protect the Israelis. We can't protect ourselves. Our fleet is sitting 200-300 miles offshore. What are we doing there? Are we maintaining the fiction that we are still the great power in the region and that nothing can happen without our permission? Okay, how much does that cost? How long can we keep up the facade until finally everybody ignores it? I think everybody's already ignoring it. I don't think you would have the Saudi, Turkish, Pakistani axis if they thought we were still a major player in the region. And I think that the Egyptians, although they initially rejected membership in this alignment, I think they'll come around to joining it because they're in a very exposed position. So I don't see anything particularly good happening, but the best thing that could happen would be for us to focus here at home and get out of the region. But again, the Israeli government, their agents in the United States called the Zionist, Jewish, Israel lobby, whatever you want to call them, they're not going to permit that.
So there's like two scenarios here. We've got one scenario where the US can no longer afford to be in the region because of the debt crisis it's having, starts to pull out of the region. It's also inevitable because the Iranians have drawn a red line for bases in the Gulf. That would leave a pretty big power vacuum in the region that would lead to Saudi trying to deal with the Houthi problem militarily, Turkey and Israel fighting for Syria. There's a power struggle in Lebanon as well when it comes to Hezbollah, Iran wanting Hezbollah because Hezbollah is very important for them, for the Mediterranean, to control the energy flows. If they go through the Mediterranean instead of the Strait of Hormuz, they'll be fighting there. You've got the Gulf and Iran. There might be power struggles on who controls the Strait of Hormuz. So we've got the whole region now lost with the US hegemon that initially was the main power that dictated what happened is no longer there. And all these voids will have to be filled. That leads to a lot of instability in the region. Option two, the US remains in the region, but it's a lot weaker than it was. It also hasn't been really very stable. If it remains in the region, it's there for a reason. As you said, Israel would want the US to do the bidding for them. So the US would be doing the same things it's been doing the last 2 decades, and we'll just see a repeat of the same. I just feel like the fear of American power is gone after the loss to the Iranians, and that with that fear gone, that was a strong deterrent against anyone doing something the US wasn't happy with. But now no one, they don't fear that anymore. The Iranians don't fear being attacked by the Americans again. So the Iranians might be more bold in advancing their interests anywhere else in the region. That applies to other countries as well. Is there a scenario where things end well, a realistic scenario where things end well? Because I'm struggling to see it. I'm usually pretty optimistic.
Well, if we don't come to the conclusion that the past is past and we cannot revivify it, in other words, we can't regain our basis and play the role that we did in the past, if that's not going to happen, I don't see any evidence that it will happen, then at least the people that live in the Gulf can make some decisions. And right now, I think probably the ruling elites in the Gulf are trying to hope for some sort of resolution that leaves them some measure of insurance that we will continue not only to do business with them, but somehow or another help them. The problem with that is that we're broke. And if we leave the Gulf, which I think we will, because I just don't see how we get back in, who is going to help finance the reconstruction of all the infrastructure that's being destroyed? Trick question. China. So China will replace us in the region in that sense. Now, the Chinese are a little different from us. They're not interested in bases and stationing Chinese forces on foreign soil. That's not the way they do business. They want goodwill, they want access, and they will certainly use their naval forces to help guard or protect the movement of ships and so forth to and out of the Gulf. But they're not interested in occupying anything. That's a big difference, and the Chinese have demonstrated that repeatedly. We have, over 800 bases. Some people say 950. I don't know how many the exact total is anymore. But the Chinese, I think the Chinese have 2 beyond their borders, and the Russians right now 1. So
in Syria?
Yeah, I think that's the only one that I recollect is beyond Russian borders. And that's a legacy of the Soviet period. Now, the Russians could easily get bases elsewhere. And I'm a little surprised that Putin has not looked elsewhere. I personally, if I were sitting in the Kremlin, would want to wash my hands of Syria and get out. But for whatever reason, he seems to want to stay. I guess what I'm saying is that this alliance, this Russia, Iran, China, supplemented, augmented by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, essentially signals that we no longer have a role. I think we're out.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to cry over that. Personally, I would welcome the exit because I don't think we benefit from stationing the bases there. Now, we did 25, 30, 40 years ago. For instance, if you go into the defense industries, go to a place like Raytheon or Northrop Grumman, you'll find out that the Emirates basically funded all of what we call non-recurring engineering. So if you wanted to build a missile from scratch, they funded the building of that prototype missile and everything associated with it. That's very important. In other words, it didn't come out of our defense budget. It wasn't something the American people paid for. These Emirates in Saudi Arabia, they paid for it because those missiles were ultimately used to do what? Defend them.
Mm.
Well, that's obviously over. And there are lots of people in the defense industry who aren't very happy about us leaving the region because they're looking for other cash cows.
Yeah.
These are things that most people aren't aware of that are extraordinarily important if you're in the defense business. I think we're going to have to build our own equipment from now on. We're going to have to subsidize our own equipment. It's not going to be done for us by, the Emirates or Saudi Arabia. And of course, you've seen, I'm sure, some of these Lego comedies that are put out that show, I guess, the UAE. Is it the UAE? No, I guess it's Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, who is sort of depicted as the milk cow. And that, Trump comes over and milks him and so forth. Well, that's not far from the truth. That's not far from the truth at all.
I haven't seen that one. It is a Trump milking MPS.
Yeah, and that's not a surprise. And, Trump has basically tried to use his military power as a means of extracting more benefits from the people in the region. The problem is that the Iranians have now put an end to that. They've demonstrated the military power is impotent in the face of their capabilities. So I think our time is over. And everybody fights that in Washington, I mean, it's sort of similar to the British Empire, the British bankrupt themselves unnecessarily in the war with Germany. There are a lot of things they could have done instead of declaring war instantly on Germany and staying in a permanent state of war with Germany until Germany was destroyed, because doing that destroyed Britain. And then suddenly the empire for which they were sacrificing, so they said, had to be liquidated almost overnight. And the biggest chunk, of course, was India. The British probably extracted somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 trillion in wealth from India. They didn't want to give that up. They didn't have any choice. They were desperately in debt to us. They only recently paid off the World War II debt. And they were still paying off the World War I debt, I think, in the 80s or 90s. I mean, it's ridiculous.
They only recently paid off the World War II debt.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the British mortgaged everything to the destruction of Germany, and then they thought, when Keynes went to the Bretton Woods conference, he thought that we would be grateful to them since they had so willingly sacrificed themselves on the altar of victory for us. Absolutely not. They thought they were going to get a grant out of us, similar to the Marshall Plan for Great Britain. No. We took Britain to the cleaners. We reinforced their destruction. I mean, there were freighters towards the end of the war leaving from South Africa, packed with gold that went straight to New York City. Britain was bankrupted. It lost everything. Well, we're bankrupting ourselves right now, unnecessarily. But we have this problem. It's called Israel.
As a final question, is there a scenario where the US breaks off that relationship with Israel, fundamentally changes it following this war?
Well, you just said the key word, following the war. The war is not going to end anytime soon, because right now you have the group that says, we'll maintain this blockade as long as we need to. I've heard people say, we'll maintain it, and then we'll resume the war later when we have rebuilt our stocks. That's one group. The other group says, we'll maintain the blockade, but we'll use these tactical nuclear weapons because we got to come out of this as the winner. If we don't come out, we're exposed. Our great power status is lost. We're no longer seen as the hegemon. Well, I think that's already happened, don't you? But that's not the view in Washington. And everything we've done, really, I'd say since the early 90s, we talk about this rules-based liberal international order. And if you ask what that is, the first question is, well, what are the rules? Well, these are norms that, we've said. What about international law? No. Because you see, grounded in international law is the concept of state sovereignty. We don't respect other people's sovereignty. If we did, we wouldn't just march into their countries at will, would we? So we have no interest in that. We said the liberal international order was to spread democracy, human rights, and goodwill. But after years of interventions, you reach the conclusion that it's about hegemony and destroying any competition that might infringe on your hegemony. Well, Iran turns out to be the place where the buck stops. Our hegemony is ending in the Persian Gulf. And you're seeing two world systems collide. You see, on the one hand, the old, what I would call Cold War plus hegemonic American global military, political, economic system. And on the other side, BRICS. BRICS is emerging with China at its center and Russia helping to lead it. And people are migrating into BRICS and away from the Western system. Why? Because they're tired of being bullied. They're tired of the World Bank being used as a cudgel to beat them over the head. You want a loan? You want a good loan? Well, then here are the requirements that we have for you from Washington. You have to do the following 16 things. Change your trade relationships, your commercial relationships, change your society, alter your government structure, meet our standards and all these things. People are tired of that. They don't want it anymore. So everything is coming together of all places in the Persian Gulf. But I guess it makes sense when you look at the Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization as far as we're concerned. So perhaps it's all ending where it all began.
Sure. Colonel, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time. And who do you think will be struck between now and next week before we speak again? We should make bets every time we speak.
Oh, no, I don't like to do that, I think it's just better to drink heavily and hope for the best.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll drink heavily and hope for the best as well. Thanks, Colonel.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
See you next time.